Hello again. I'm Frank Jernigan, and this is a series on how to work the shawl that I am publishing in the Cast On magazine spring issue of 2021. It's called the Archangel Wing Shawl. I've made more progress, and I've decided that I'm going to do something a little different than I originally planned. I'm going to work through one module and do it from step to step and record each time I get to something new. And I will put it all in one video, but it will be in segments, and then I will put timestamps underneath the video saying where each segment starts. So if you get caught on a certain step and you're not sure how to proceed, you might be able to find how to work that step. And they'll be in order as we come to them, and I think that's a good order to take things up for the most part. So just to let you know, I've now worked 12 panels of the shawl, and as you see, it started with red in the gradient yarn. It proceeds through more of an orange color, and then it progresses farther, and it finally becomes a bright yellow color. And you can't really see it fully laid out because the picture is too narrow, but it is in the shape of a very large angel wing. So it's called the Archangel Wing Shawl. I'm going to start from the very beginning of the module, or the panel, whichever word you want to use. I use them interchangeably. Sometimes I call them a module, sometimes I call them a panel. Hope that's not too confusing. And let me show you how to get started by casting on stitches in the very beginning of each panel. Repeat. As you see, I now have, well, you can't see, but I actually do have 95 stitches on my needles. In your first module, you're told to cast on 95 stitches and place a counter marker every 10 stitches. Oh, that's the wrong end. This is the wrong with 10. So I started at this end, and that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's 10 stitches. I place a counter marker. My counter markers are black. That's how I designate which ones are counter markers. I use other colors for increase markers, which we have many of in the process. But right now, there are no increase markers on the yarn, on the needles at all. It's just every 10 stitches, there is a counter marker. So this is marker number 10, number 20, number 30, number 40, number 50, number 60, number 70, number 80, and number 90. After number 90, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are 95 stitches on the needles. You may have noticed that some of these stitches are double. Of course, when you cast on the first time, they're not double, but these are double stitches left from when short rows were completed at the last, or at the very end of the last repeat of the panel. So the first instruction for the panel starts by saying using knitted cast on 95 stitches, placing a counter marker every 10 stitches. Here's where the repeat starts. So this is where I've come back to. It says the stitches are to be renumbered again. That's because at the beginning of each module, the marker that was number 20 now becomes number 10 because you've bound off 10 stitches at the beginning of the panel. But that will become clear later. Here's the first instruction. Using knitted cast on one stitch, place a marker. PM means place an increase marker. Cast on 3 stitches, place another increase marker. Cast on 3 stitches. PHM is the only time it's used in the instruction, is place 100 marker, which is a counter marker. So that will be a black marker marking the 100th stitch in the series. Then I cast on 1, place another increase marker, cast on 3, another increase marker, cast on 4, and so forth. In the end, there will be 117 stitches on the needles, but because there are counter markers that are placed on at the same time, there are only 111 numbered stitches. So this is confusing, perhaps, if you're not familiar with the fact that we don't number stitches after the counter markers. These counter markers are not indicating, there's nothing unusual about the cast on stitch. It's just saying that this cast on stitch is in place of if you had done an increase, and you treat it as if it was an increase, and you count it as if it was an increase. So you do not count any of the, you do not number any of the stitches after a placed marker. It's considered an increase. So I hope that's not too confusing. It's the only time that comes into play, where you're placing, casting on stitches without actually doing an increase, but calling it an increase. So let me work you through that step, and it's very important at the end of that step that you go back and you look at all of the stitches and count the stitches according to what you've, not only what you've cast on, but where you have placed counter markers, and make sure that the count comes out at 111 instead of 117, even though there are 117 stitches on the needles. So to begin with, I'm working with color A. And I'm using the knitted cast on. And so the first instruction is to cast on 1 stitch. Then place an increase marker. Okay, here's a little tip I've learned. Notice it's a little hard to get the needle back in there with the counter marker on it and to work that stitch. So I have an improved technique for this. I have cast on 1 and placed a marker. Now I'm going to cast on 3. 1, 2, 3. Now I'm supposed to place a counter marker, but before I place that marker, I'm going to actually work the stitch, pull it to the front, but not put it on the needle. Then I'm going to place the counter marker and then put the loop over the needle. It's just much easier to work that way. That's 1, 2, 3. I'm going to begin my next cast on stitch, pull it through and hold it there. Now I'm going to place the 100 marker. I'm using black markers as my counter markers, so I'm putting a black marker on to indicate that last stitch there is stitch number 100. Let me make this a little bigger so you can see what I'm doing perhaps a little bit better. Place that loop on the needle. I am supposed to, after the 100 marker, I only cast on one. I get ready to cast on the next one, and I place another counter marker, not a black one. Now I cast on 3. That's 1, 2, 3. Begin my next cast on, but don't complete it. Place another marker. Now complete that cast on. That's 1. This time I do 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll begin the next one. Place a marker, an increase marker. Did I call the last one a counter marker? I'm out of. The ones that are not black are increase markers. Complete that. That's now I do 3, 1, 2, 3, start the next one, place another marker, and now I end by doing 4 more. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, what I'm going to do now, right now, I have to tell you, is extremely important. That series of instructions is so confusing that at least half the time I get it wrong. And I might have gotten it wrong in this video, but it always is helpful to go back and number the stitches and make sure you come out at stitch number 111 at the end, and then you know you've done it right. So let's do that. We'll start at stitch number 100. I'm sorry, we're going to start at stitch number 90. So this was the first one. These were already on the needle when we started. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we added more, so that became number 6. Then we have an increase marker, so we don't count the next stitch. Number 7, number 8, another increase marker. Couldn't see that one in my light, and it's tangled a little bit. Don't count that one. 9, 10. And there is my 100 marker, which is exactly right. The 110th stitch is right before you get to the number 110 marker. Now we continue. 100, I'm sorry, that was the 100 marker, not 110. So that was the 100 marker, marking this stitch as the 100 stitch. So then we have 101, don't count this one, 102, 103, don't count this one, 104, 105, 6, don't count this one, 7, 8, don't count this one, 9, 10, 11. Now notice any stitch that is not counted is never the end of a row where you need to turn. You always turn on a counted marker. I mean a counted stitch. You always turn on a counted stitch. So you never turn one stitch after an increase marker. That's just a little hint. So my recommendation is that you always do that final check to make sure you cast on the right number and place the markers in the right place. And then you're ready to proceed to the next instruction. The next instruction is to do a German short row turn at the end of this instruction. I'm sorry, it says just do a turn, not a short row turn, sorry. And then we knit all the way down to stitch number 48. I have a reminder here because I don't always go back up and read this when I'm doing a repeat. It's a reminder every time you start the repeat, when you want to find stitch number 48, those markers that were set the last time through the panel have now all changed by a count of 10. So when you look for stitch number 48, make sure your first decade marker is marker number 10, even though you removed marker number 10 during the production of the last panel. So to do that, we start down here at this end. Here's our first one, 10, and then 20, and then 30, and then 40, and then 50. So this is stitch number 50, 49, 48. I'm going to place a marker there. I don't always do this, but sometimes I do it when I have a large number of stitches to knit. And you can right away see the advantage of the way of writing these instructions by numbering the stitches instead of counting them. If we're at stitch number 117, not, the count number 117, and you want to go all the way down to stitch number 48, the instruction would be knit 111 minus 48 stitches, whatever that number is. And you would have to count that number of stitches. And once you knitted them, how would you know you were in the right place to turn? You'd have to count them again to make sure. You certainly don't want to count every time you do a long series of stitches. So now all we have to do is knit down to that marker that I just placed. And I will continue the video when we get there, and we'll talk about how to do a German short row turn. Now I've knitted down to stitch number 48, and I'm ready to do my first German short row turn. So I thought I'd show you how to do it at this point. But you might ask, why am I choosing to do German short row turns? And can you substitute a different kind of turn? Well, the pattern is written on the assumption that you're doing German short row turns, and so I recommend that you do them. Otherwise, all of your stitch counts will be off by 1 in each direction, or else you have to modify the pattern, which would be an extremely tedious thing to do. So the easiest thing to do is to learn to do a German short row turn. The reason I chose German short rows is because they are probably the simplest to do. They look fine in garter stitch as well as in stockinette stitch, and they are just very easy to do. You don't have to pick up a wrap, you just have to know to knit the result together when you come to it, but they're very easy to see. You don't have hidden wraps that you have to find and then pick up and make sure you pick them up in the right direction, or else they show on the wrong side. None of that. So it's just very simple. So let me show you where I'm at in my knitting, and that's right here. So as you see, I've knitted down to this marker that I placed at the 48th stitch. This black one is marking number stitch 50, that's stitch 49, that's stitch 48. This was just a temporary marker to help me see when to stop knitting, so I'm going to take that off. To do a German short row turn, I simply turn the work around. The yarn is now in front, and I keep it in front. I insert the right needle into the stitch as if to purl, and I pull it off of the needle. I pull up slightly on the yarn here to bring that stitch up to the top of the needle, if you think of that as the top, and then I just knit the next stitch as normally, which actually does a kind of a yarn over, but it's not really a yarn over because you've caught this stitch and made a double stitch instead of a new stitch. So now the instruction says to knit back to stitch number 63. Well, I'm at number 48. So now I'm going to knit up to number 63. Let me show you that, so in case you haven't seen this before. We just did to 48, then we, at the hyphen or dash, we do a short row turn, then we stitch to knit to stitch number 63. I know this is stitch number 50 and this is stitch number 60, so I'm going to knit 3 stitches past this. I don't have to count 15 stitches or whatever that is. I just knit. This is stitch number 60, 61, 62, 63. Another German short row turn, turn the work around. The yarn is still in front, or is now in front. I insert the needle as if to purl, pull it off the left needle and tug slightly, and then knit in the other direction. That's how you perform this German short row turn. Now I'm going to continue this section and pick it up again when I get to the, we're actually in a section that knits a peak. Each row gets shorter from both ends until finally we knit 2 German short rows right next to each other. I'll stop, I'll start again when I get to that point. Now I'm at the place in the instructions where I have done all of these instructions down to this point right here. I'm about to do this German short row turn at stitch number 55. Notice each one on the wrong side has increased 1 stitch each time, and on the right side it has decreased 1 stitch each time, so that makes a triangular peak. I'm now at that peak. I'm going to do the last 2 short rows. This is stitch number 55 that I just turned around, and I'm going to insert my needle purlwise, pull it off and up, and then knit stitch number 56. And the instruction says, oh, you get to 56? Do another German short row turn. So there's no problem to do 2 German short row turns, one right next to the other. And now we start knitting, we do that short row turn and we start knitting in the other direction. I mean, down. Actually, what we're doing is we're going to knit down the side of this angle, this diagonal of the triangular area that I just worked. And because we're going down a diagonal, there are going to be increases. The pattern tells you where to do the increases. You don't have to worry about, am I on a diagonal or not? The pattern tells you. So here's what the instruction in the pattern says. I just did the short row turn at 56. I knit to stitch number 54. I then do a make one and then place a marker. Then I knit the stitch number 51, and I do another make one, and I place a marker, and then I slip the counter marker that I find at that location, knit to stitch 49, do another make one, place another increase marker, and then knit to stitch number 24. If I called any of these counter markers except this one, they're all increase markers. And then we turn, once we get to 24, we're going to do a German short row turn and knit back to stitch number 31 and do another one. And then we're going to work on another smaller peak at that location. So I'd like to point out that the instructions tell you whether to do the make one before or after you place the marker. And why would there be a difference? You always want the marker to be on the upper side, you want the increase to be on the upper side of the marker, upper as in the direction they're counted. So since we're on the reverse side, you do the make one first and then place the marker, and so the increased stitch is above the marker in the count. When you are doing increases on the right side, it'll be after the dash, and there are some like that. It will also tell you to place a marker, but it'll have place the marker and then do the increase. So pay attention to where the order of the instructions, and you'll always have the markers in the right position. In executing this, we're going to start by showing what you do when you are knitting and you come to a German short row turn where that's been done. The first one is the double stitch of the last German short row turn. I'm actually doing a German short row turn while I do it. So the instructions to do this turn is pull the yarn up and knit the next stitch in the other direction. Well, knitting the next stitch in the other direction is to knit a double stitch from the last German short row turn. So we do that. Just knit it as though it was one stitch, and we count them as if they're one stitch. The instruction says to knit to number 54. That was 55. Here's 54. Now we're going to do our first increase. There are two kinds of increases used in this pattern, and they are both marked M1, and which kind you do depends on what you find when you get there. If you find that you're doing an increase between what were two double stitches, as in this case, that was a double stitch there and this is a double stitch here, then how do you do the increase? It's technically a left lifted increase with a twist, but I'll just show you how to do it. You take this purl bump, the one that is below the stitch you're on, the purl bump right there, I put it on the right needle and then transfer it to the left needle. And then, in order to add a twist to it to make sure it really closes up nicely, I knit into the back stitch. So I call that a left lifted increase with a twist. After we do the increase, we place a marker. Then we knit to stitch number 51. This is 53, 52, 51. Now there are only two places in the pattern that it tells you to slip the counter marker, and that's because we're doing an increase at a counter marker, and you would need to know whether to slip the marker first or place the increase first. So but every other time you come to a counter marker, you just slip it. It doesn't matter. In this case, the instruction specifically says do a make one, then place the increase marker, then slip the counter marker. Notice if I didn't have that instruction, I might think I should slip the counter marker now. But no, I'm going to hold off to do that. I'm going to do the increase, which is again picking up that purl bump in between the two and knitting into the back of that stitch, and then placing a marker and then slipping the counter marker. Then the instruction says to knit to stitch 49. There's 50 and 49. Once again, we do an increase that was between two double stitches. Why are all these double stitches together? Because we shortened each row one stitch as we went up to that peak. So all these double stitches were placed right next to each other. I knit into the back of it to twist it, and then I add an increase marker. So the increase is on the upper count side of the marker. So later, when we're counting these stitches, we count up and we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Don't count 9, 10, or 50. The instruction then says to knit down to stitch number 24. So there's nothing unusual there. I will pause the video and pick up when Actually, I'm not going to show you how to do the next peak because we just did one and there's nothing new there. So we'll now work all of the instructions down until we get to this instruction right here, 11 to 13, and then down to knit to 2 and turn and bind off. I'd like to illustrate how to do that bind off, the turn and the bind off. I'm now working this instruction. I have completed this small peak here, worked it down here, and then did these few rows that are sort of a flattened squiggle, not really a peak. And now I'm working down to knit to 2 and turn. The word turn means don't do a German short row turn, do a regular turn, and I'll show you that. And then we will bind off 1 and we don't turn. Switch to color B and then knit to stitch 30. So that's what I'm going to show you. Don't worry about these yarns hanging off here. We'll discuss those a little later. You won't have them on your first module because you just cast on color A. So I'm working down to stitch number 2. That's stitch number 4, 3, 2. When we turn and bind off, we always have one stitch left on the left needle. So now the instructions are to turn. Just simply turn it around. And as any normal turn, you then pass the yarn through to the back, like that. And then the instruction says to bind off 1. So I've got one stitch on this needle already. So to bind off 1, you simply knit 1 and then pass this loop over that new stitch. And that's bind off 1. Now I switch to color B, which is, for me, is this yellow. You'll start a new thread the first time you're doing this, a new color B. I'm using one that I've carried up the back side of the fabric. So I then stitch or work up to stitch number 30. And it's that simple. Here's 10, 20, 30. 30 is the last stitch before that marker. So I will end at that marker. The first instruction has you knit all the way from where you did the bind off and started a new color all the way out to stitch number 110, which is one stitch before the end, number 111. And along the way, you're going to do some increases. You're going to do them in the right order here. This is the other place in the pattern that says knit to stitch 30, then slip the counter marker, place a marker, and do a make one. Then more make ones. The only difference with these make ones is you place the marker before you do the make one because we're on the right side. So you place the marker and then do the make one. That means the increase is still on the upper side of the marker. Let me just put in a little video right here, a little segment right here to show you again how to count stitches when you come across increase markers. I'm looking for stitch number 58. This is stitch number 50 right here, 50. Notice I have a counter marker and an increase marker, so I don't number the next stitch. That's no count. 1, 2, 3. Increase marker, don't count. 4, 5, knitting the double stitch together, 6, another double stitch, 7, and another double stitch, 8. And I'm going to do an increase there, but first I'm going to place an increase marker. As the instructions say, place the marker, then do the increase because we're on the right side of the fabric. And that's how you count up to stitch number 58, not counting the ones after each of these two, these two increase markers. Let me just catch you up to where I am. I knitted the first row in color B all the way out to stitch number 110 right here, one short of the end, 111. Did a short row turn, knitted back to stitch number 94, which is this one, this double stitch. I did a German short row turn there, creating that double stitch. I knitted back out to stitch number 108, which is this one. That's a double stitch. And then I am going back to the part of the pattern that says knit to stitch number 94 and then make one, place a marker, and then knit stitch 93. This is a very common sequence throughout this part of the pattern. You're going to knit to a certain stitch. In fact, you're going to knit to the stitch you did a German short row in the row before. You're going to then do a make one and then knit one more stitch and then head back in the other direction. But the reason I'm showing you is this is actually the first time we do a make one that is between a double stitch and a single stitch. So here we are. I'm at stitch number 95. This is 95. And then 94 is the double stitch. I'm going to do a make one. I'm sure you know how to do this. You just grab that strand that runs between the two stitches, put it on the needles, and knit through the back. And that twists it to the left, doing a make one left. You then knit stitch number 93 according to the directions. Oh, sorry, I forgot to place the marker, didn't I? After you do, After you do the make one, you place the marker because we're on the wrong side, so it's placed after you do the make one. And then we knit stitch number 93 and we do a short row turn. Turn it around. And as usual, just lift off and continue knitting in the other direction. So that's the other form of the increase stitch that the pattern. I want to point out an error that I made in an earlier video segment, and I can't go back and correct it, so I'm just going to have to tell you it wasn't a critical error. It doesn't tell you to do something wrong. It's just that astute observers will wonder why I said what I said. And that was when I was talking about starting from this end. I had come all the way out to stitch number 110. And then I said I knitted back to stitch number 94, German short row, and then I came back and I mistakenly said I knitted out to stitch number 108, but in fact I had knitted out to stitch number 109. And that is not 108 right there. This is 108, just before this last marker. And there are in fact 4 stitches after it. So that's 108. There was the increase marker we placed on when we did the cast-ons. Don't count that. That's 109, 110, 111. If you were a really close observer, you would notice that there were only 3 stitches after that marker when I said that, and that confused me. And so I went back and looked at it. It turns out I had dropped a stitch, and I had to go all the way back and correct the whole thing. But anyway, just wanted to let you know that that was an error. Well, I've now completed all of color B on the last panel that I'll be working on this shawl. As you know, we started here at the beginning of the row where the numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 10, and we knitted the first row all the way to the end to stitch number 110. We did a short row turn and then worked this block here, and then progressed back down the row to work this block here, and then this little block here, and now I'm all the way back at the beginning. When you finish the row, there is just 1 stitch left on the other needle. I've temporarily transferred it to this needle just to show you this. So how do I know this is the last module that I'll be doing? So let me take a minute just to discuss how many modules you want to repeat. The way you know you're at the end is you run out of color B. The idea is to use up the entire skein of gradient yarn that you started with. And there are 2 ways to do that. It happens that I measured this before working the last module and worked it after, measured it after, and I found out that it takes about 5 or 6 grams of yarn to work 1 module, 1 repeat of the panel. So you could weigh your yarn when it starts getting small and see if you've got, say, 6 grams left, and then you can be pretty sure that you can get 1 more panel in. Or alternatively, you can do it the way I did it, because I didn't think to do that first. And you just look at what you've got left and you say, well, I think that's enough to get another module done. And so you start working it, and then it starts getting less and less and less, and then you start worrying, oh, am I going to have enough to finish this module? And then you stress out and you end up all stressed, and that's not what you want to do. So you could just work 12 panels and say, I'm done with it, and whatever's left over is thrown away, or you can measure it, or you can hope like I did and it worked out because I have this little tiny bit of yarn left over when I'm done. And I don't need any more color B to complete the panel. So now let's talk about how to move on to the next color, color C, and I will show you how that's done. I've now worked my way up to this part of the pattern where I'm about to do one final turn, bind off one stitch in color A, and then switch to color C. This is the first time we see this instruction, which occurs twice. It occurs here and when you switch back to color A. If not breaking the yarn, weave color B through stitch number 13. What that's referring to is the optional choice that you may make to weave in the yarn as you knit so that you don't cut it each time you finish a panel and then weave in the ends later. Frankly, I really dislike weaving in ends, and it's probably not considered the optimal way to do it, but I would rather carry the yarn up the back of the fabric. If you think about it, in my shawl, there are 13 repeats. Each repeat if you cut the yarn each time, it would have maybe 6 or 8 ends, depending on how you cut color A, both before and after you used it or whatever. But you would have a lot of ends for each panel, and there are 13 of them. So you could have as many as 50 or 60 ends to weave in after you've completed the module. I just really didn't want to do that, so I carry the yarn up the back. This is the right side of the fabric, as you see. You don't see any evidence that yarn has been carried up the back. This is the wrong side. You've got all these purl bumps anyway, so why not add a few more extra bumps and color changes that really don't matter. Here is where the yarn has been woven in and then carried along the top before it is used again. This is back in the beginning of the shawl where I was working in the red color. Here it is closer to the end I am now working on where there's a yellow color. And what you'll see is occasionally there's an extra little loop that sticks up, and that's the real difference. I mean, if that bothers you, then weave in all the ends. But I think it's worth it. And if you are extremely careful, which I'm not always, you can actually get to the point where those don't show at all. Let me see if I can find one where I did it correctly. Like here, right there, you hardly see any vertical yarn threads at all, or here. So it's a little tricky to do. The first one is not very tricky, and you just have to learn the technique that I'm using. The second one is a little more difficult, but I promise when you get used to doing it, you'll be glad you did. Oh, you might have a question of, what about the stretchiness? Doesn't that affect the stretchiness? Well, look, you're right at the edge where you've done bind-offs all along the edge anyway. Those are not as stretchy as the fabric. You don't want them to be. They're supporting the shawl. And so they don't add any lack of stretchiness to the edge at all. So that's not a problem. So now, let me get started and show you how to do the weaving in case you choose to do that. The first instruction says to turn and bind off one stitch in color A. So I believe I've already shown you how to do that, but I'll show you again. You always knit one stitch and then take the stitch that was left on the needle and pass it over. And of course, you've all done that many times, so you know how to bind off a stitch. Now, the next instruction says to knit up to stitch number 25. But we're going to weave in the yarn through stitch number 13. The way we weave in the yarn is by having it go over and under alternate purl bumps on the back. To do that, we pick up color C, which is the dark blue one. I put color B in my left hand. Of course, this is how you do it if you're not a continental knitter. But anyway, so I work a stitch, then I get ready to work another stitch, and I bring the weaving color to the front and over, and I finish that stitch, and then I bring the yarn back. I then knit one more stitch normally, begin the next stitch, bring it over, I've forgotten how to knit, sorry. Knit the next stitch, bring it back. It's funny, sometimes when you're making a video, you can't do things you've done a million times. I knit the next stitch, then I knit the next one, bring it over, bring it back. That was stitch number 10. Oh, by the way, the instructions point out that you've now bound off stitches at the beginning. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. We've bound off 2 stitches. There's just no stitch numbered 1 and 2 anymore. The stitch numbers don't change. This is still stitch number 3 like it always was, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And it stays that way until you start the repeat for the next panel. So just remember that these stitches are going to gradually get bound off while we're working these different colors, and eventually they'll all be bound off, and 10 stitches will get bound off before we then restart the module for the next panel. Now let's see, I brought it over, so I now knit a stitch, bring it back, that's 12. So since I'm going through 13, I just don't do any more. You know, it's really 12 or 13, whatever. Which also reminds me, when you're working this, you may come to an instruction that doesn't appear to be indicating what you expect to see at that place, and it might be because you've made a simple mistake, like forgot to do an increase, or did an increase and forgot to put in a marker. You'll be off by 1 stitch, but you can correct those at any time. If you're off by a stitch, it really doesn't matter. So don't go back and correct errors just because you've missed an increase. Just remember that later when you're supposed to knit 2 together, you'll have to figure out that you don't need to do that. All right, so now we knit up to stitch number 25. Notice we now have more increase markers all along the row than you probably thought there would be. They just are all up and down the row. And this instruction that we're working on right now will remove a lot of those increase markers. I haven't shown you how to do the RMK2T. That stands for remove marker and knit 2 together. And the reason I combine those 2 together is because Removing the marker occurs in different ways in different places. Sometimes the marker comes before the 2 stitches to knit together. Sometimes it comes after the 2 stitches to knit together. You knit to that stitch number, and then you know that the next 2 stitches have to be knit together. So wherever the marker is, you remove it. So that's why it doesn't say remove the marker and then knit 2 together. Also, let me point out that when you execute this command, in every case, you will be knitting together a single stitch with 1 double stitch, always. You are never knitting 2 double stitches together, which would make a big bulky knit 2 together. And you're most likely, or if you follow all the pattern instructions perfectly, you're not knitting 2 single stitches together. If you get to a number where you're supposed to execute this command and it doesn't look like the next 2 stitches are a single and a double in either order, then look around there for a single and a double and knit those 2 together and remove the marker that's close to them. That just means you made a simple mistake somewhere, and that's the way to correct it. You might also want to count the stitches between the last decade marker, counter marker, and the next decade counter marker, and make sure that eliminating, not counting the stitches on the upper side of each increase marker, you have 10 stitches at all times. So we're knitting to stitch number 25, and we're going to work our first RMK2T. That's stitch number 20. 21. 22. Don't count this stitch, but I knit it anyway. 23. 24. 25. I check, and sure enough, the next 2 stitches are a single and a double. I remove the marker and I knit those 2 together. The next instruction is to knit to stitch number 48. I'll pause the video here and continue when I get to stitch 48 so we can see how another. So now I'm at stitch number 48, and I'll show you how I counted that. Here is the marker for stitch number 40. So the one after that marker is 41. Don't count because there's an increase marker. 42, 43. Don't count. 44, 45. Don't count. 46, 47, 48. So I look at the next 2 stitches that I'm supposed to knit together, and sure enough, one is a single, one is a single, and one is a double. So I'll remove that marker. Now remember, sometimes the marker will be after the 2 stitches, and sometimes it's between them. And when it's between them, you'd have to move 1 stitch over, take the marker off, and then put it back, and then stitch the 2 together. Now I'm just going to knit that double and that single together. Now it says that was stitch number 49 that I just made as knit 2 together. Here's stitch 50, and the instruction says after 50, knit the next 2 together. So sure enough, the next 2 are a single and a double. I'm going to continue in this fashion, and I'll stop when I get to something that you haven't seen before. I've now worked that one instruction with all those RMK2Ts in it out to the very end, except for the last few stitches. As you see, there are some increase markers that are left in place, but many have been removed. And I'm now completing the first row all the way out to the end. Let me show you one more thing. When you're doing RMK2Ts, sometimes it's hard to get the needle in there. And I find that it's a lot easier if you insert from this side into the second stitch, pull it down, and then insert the needle from the other side, and it goes through easily. It doesn't matter whether that stitch is a double or a single, because it could be either. Just go to the second stitch from the right side and pull it down, making it larger, and then it's easier to work. So the instruction was to go out to stitch number 110, which is what that is. There's one stitch left on the needles, and then it says, it does not say turn, so that means I now do a German short row turn. And this is the only place where you do a German short row turn on top of a double stitch, but it really works just fine. Now we'll work back in the other direction to stitch number 73 and continue working the pattern. When I come to something new, I'll stop and continue another segment. So I've now completed all of the section with color B, and I'm down to the place where we switch back to color A to finish the panel. Unlike color B and C, we don't work all the way to 110 and then work our way slowly back down to the beginning. Instead, we work one pass up to stitch number 110. And along the way, we do lots of a few inverted triangles to fill in some gaps. And we also increase every 5 stitches so that the panel gets wider by 1 stitch every 5 stitches from end to end. And we also do enough RMK2Ts to remove all of the increase markers by the time we get to the end. So that said, let me start with the very beginning, which is optionally weaving in color B as you begin to work with color A one more time. So let's begin to work. Here I am at the place where I've knitted down to stitch number 3. No, I'm sorry, I've knitted down to stitch number 4, and I'm going to pick up color A and continue working with it. I'm going to show you how to weave in color B and up to where it gets even with where we've placed color C. I'm sorry, I'm getting the letters mixed up. I'm going to weave in the ends of color C till it gets to number 13, which is where we have color B, A, C, A, B. I can't even get it straight. Anyway, the blue color is going to be woven in up to the 13th stitch, which is where the yellow color has already been woven up to. I guess it's getting a little tiring making these videos, trying to get them all in a 2-day stretch. Just bear with me if I say the wrong thing, and I'll try to make it right like I did earlier in this section, a few sections back. Okay, so the instruction says, the reason this is more complicated, by the way, is that we don't just start knitting and knit up to stitch 25 like we did with the last color. We actually knit up a few stitches, then back a few stitches, and then up a few more stitches, and back a few, and then bind off a few, and then knit up again, and then bind back. And anyway, until we finally bound off all 10 stitches up to the first 10 marker. So I will show you that whole process. It may be a little tedious to watch me, but you might find that it's something you want to do. Just always remember that when you're on the right side knitting, you want to weave in this yarn. If you're on the wrong side, you do not weave it in, because then you're going back down. And if you did weave in there, the yarn would be placed on the right side of the fabric, and you don't want that. So we're going to start by binding off. Let's see how many stitches it says. We're going to bind off one stitch and then knit to stitch number 7. So I'm going to bind off one stitch, then knit to stitch number 7. So I'm going to start with a regular stitch, and then I'm going to pick up my blue strand, bring it over to the front, and complete the next stitch. Knit one stitch. This is stitch number 10, 9, 8. That's stitch number 7. I now reverse and go back to stitch number 5. Seven, 6, 5. And as usual, I'm left with one stitch on the left needle. The instructions say to turn, so I don't do a German short row turn. I simply turn and pass the yarn to the back. And then it says bind off 2 stitches. So I will bind off 2 stitches. That's 1. That's 2. Now we knit to stitch number 10. So I'm going to continue weaving in because we still haven't reached stitch number 13 yet. I'm going to start by just knitting one regular, and then I'm going to bring the yarn forward from the back, work the stitch, take it again to the back. That's 9. One more. 10. Turn and work back to stitch number 7. That's 10, 9, 8, 7. Again, we're left with one stitch on the left needle. We turn and we bind off 4 stitches. It's 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is a double stitch because I just turned there last time. Now I knit to 17, so I'm going to knit 1, Weave the yarn in one more time. That's stitch number 12. And then stitch number 13, so I don't need to do another one. Now I can forget about weaving in for a while. 14, 15, 16, 17. You can see that's 18 and 19. Skip one. If I can arrange the marker here so you can see it. Okay, 18, 19, skip one, 20. And that's the last one before the decade marker. That's 17, I'll go back to 15, 16, 15, turn, German short row, go back to 18, short row turn, down to 14, 17, 16, 15, 14, back to 19, Now we'll go back to 11, do a normal turn and bind off 1. Thirteen, 12, 11. What happened? Did I forget to bind off the last stitch before I got to 10? I did. So here's what you do when you need to fix that. I simply forgot to bring the loop over. It's not too late. Pass that loop over there. Now, when you get back to stitch 11, there's supposed to be only one stitch left on the needle, and that's how I knew I'd done something wrong. Yes, I make mistakes. You'll make mistakes. They're all easy to recover from, and you can just fudge some of them, and it doesn't matter. If you really get messed up, you can undo some sections, but most of the time you don't have to do that. So now it says, do a turn and bind off 1. Well, to bind off 1, I need to remove the decade marker that marks that this was number 10. I'll put that away. I will do my regular turn, knit 1, and cast 1 stitch over the other. Now, I have removed the first 10 stitches. However, this is still stitch number 11. I do not renumber the stitches. So this first black marker is now stitch number 20, and then 30 and 40 and 50. Sometimes, just to remind myself that that's the way it is, I'll put the black marker on after stitch 11, knowing that it's really not now numbering number 10. It's just reminding me that when I count up from the bottom and I say, where's stitch number 30, don't forget to count this one. 10, 20, 30. I found that helpful after I'd done a few modules, so you might want to use that little tip. We have bound off one. Now we work to stitch number 18. That's 11, 12, 13. Now, you might want to pick up the yarns in the back and bring them over so they are captured on this new row that you're knitting right now, and that brings them up without as much of a gap. So that's one of the ways you can shorten the amount of vertical gaps if you remember to do that. If you don't remember to do it, which I often don't, just don't even worry about it. In that case, you're just bringing it up so you don't bring it back across. You just put it behind that purl bump, if you can see that. Let's see, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Now it says to do an RMK2. Now this is the first time you've come across that. Yes, the next two stitches are a double and a single, but the marker is in between the two stitches. When it's just a little more difficult to do, you just simply have to take off the first stitch, in this case it's a double stitch, remove the marker, and put the stitch back on the left needle so you can knit them together. Again, I will put the needle into the right side of the second stitch, pull on it to loosen it a bit, and then it's easier to get the needle through the two in the right direction to knit the two together. And then I knit, that was number 19, the knit two together, and so then there's number 20. I will continue this, and we'll see if there's anything else new that I need to show you. I'll probably show you the bind offs at the other end, just to give you an idea of how that works. Now we are almost done with the panel. We have worked color A, then color B, then color C, and then gone back to color A to finish the panel. If you have worked the panel along with this video, then you have now worked color A all the way to the end where the instruction says go out to stitch number 110. I've transferred stitch number 111 to the right needle so I can hold this up and show you the result of that entire instruction. Is there are no increase markers on anywhere along the panel anymore. You have worked a knit two together and remove a marker at every single location, not in order, by the way. Sometimes you skip them. The instructions in one place actually explicitly says you're not going to remove all the markers in the following instruction, and it's because they get removed a few instructions later. So let's take a look at where we're at, and we're almost done. So as I said, I've worked this final instruction all the way out to stitch number 110. Here we do another turn that is not a short row turn, and then we just have these few instructions remaining. We're going to bind off one and work to stitch number 81 and then back out to 109, which is now the next to the last stitch. Then we're going to bind off two work to stitch number 86, work to the end, bind off 1, work to stitch, notice it goes 81, 96, 91, 96, 101. We've been moving the left-hand side up by 5 stitches every time. And so this makes a thin red wedge along the top of the panel that completes the shaping of the panel. So let's do that. Just to review one more time how to do the bind off. As I said, I had transferred this stitch from the right needle to the left, and now I'm transferring it back. You turn the work, put the yarn in the back, knit 1, and bind off 1. I then work down to stitch number 81. I'm not going to have you watch me do that all the way, but that would be, here's stitch number 100, stitch number 90, stitch number 80 is right here, 100, 90, 80. And so I'm going to work down to this stitch just above the 80 marker, which is number 81. And then I'm going to work back to the other end. I have now worked down to stitch number 81, and I'm back up, approaching the end of the row. I'm supposed to go to stitch number 109. Here's 101, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now we turn again. Pass the yarn to the back, and we bind off 2. This is the only one where you bind off 2 at this end. 1, 2, and now we continue in the other direction. All of these work exactly the same, so I won't belabor the point anymore. All done. Now we have completed one panel for the shawl, and if you notice at the very end, the instructions have you knit to 105 when there are 106 stitches on counted stitches. We bind off stitch number 106, go to stitch 101, and then back out to 105 again, which finally is the very end. And you have now knitted all stitches onto one needle, and that last section with the slight wedge I was talking about that we created, it looks like that. All of the increase markers are gone, and if you counted the stitches, you would see that there are 95 stitches on the needles. Why are there 95 when this is stitch number 105? That's because we bound off 10 stitches at the beginning. And if you recall, I suggested putting this marker on even though you have bound off 10 stitches, and that is not stitch number 10. That actually is stitch number 11, but you never have to worry about that. I just put this marker on to remind me that this is stitch number 10 and this is stitch number 20 for the rest of the time that I'm working this entire row. But what happens next? Repeat from star, star, star. I'm on the final panel, so I'm simply going to turn and knit to end and then bind off all stitches. Then you weave in ends and block. Well, what is star, star, star? Where is that? It's all the way back at the beginning of the pattern. Here. It's right after the initial cast on of 95 stitches. We again have 95 stitches on the needles. So we have reproduced the starting point for the next module. And it says, repeat from here, renumbering the stitches starting with number 1 again. So what was number 11, and had this marker here to remind me that it was stitch number 11, it now becomes stitch number 1, so I'm going to take off that marker. It was just to remind me that it was not stitch number 1. Now it is stitch number 1. So now that's stitch number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and there's the 10 marker, and so forth. You might also notice that the last pattern ended up with a double stitch at 6, 16, 26, 36, 46, 56, all the way up to 106. Actually, no, 101, sorry, the last one was on 101. And so 96 was the last 6. But then there's also a double stitch at 11, 21, 31, 41, 51, 61, 71, all the way up to 101. Just happens that that's how the module gets shaped into an exact triangle. And those increases are spaced exactly 5 apart after you finish the row. So there you have it. I have not bound off the stitches, of course. I'll do that next. And then I will post a picture of the finished shawl because you can't see it all by me holding it up. But this is how it looks when you get your 13 panels done. I hope you've enjoyed these videos and they help you work the shawl, and I hope you really love your shawl. I think it would be wonderful if people tried it with different colors. This is my second one, and the first one was done in different colors, and both of them are beautiful. You could try putting the gradient on a different color, or you could just simply use different color yarns and keep the gradient yarn where it is. The gradient, I think, gives the repetition variation enough to make the shawl more interesting, and the static colors bind it all together into a single cohesive look. So that was my thinking in designing the shawl. I hope you enjoy it.